Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto what-ifs. Today we're jumping into part 4 of What If Naruto Says I Am Not Going to Puberty Again. So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this Shinobi grinding. 3 teams finished the second phase of the Chunin exams within the first 4 hours. Naruto, Sasuke, Sakura, Gaara, Temari, Kankuro, Hinata, Kiba, Shino. These 9 genin, through either skill or dumb luck, managed to acquire the scrolls they needed and make it to the tower in the center of the forest less than a quarter of a day after the test had started. So that was 2 teams from the leaf, and 1 from the sand. Obviously there were certain advantages associated with being in the home field, but still this news left the Konoha officers feeling a tad smugly patriotic. Those who had encountered the Suna team, however, may have felt a twinge of sympathy for the genin squads 8 and 7. These 6-leaf rookies would need to spend the next 4.5 days in relatively close quarters with the Hidden Sands contestants, and none of those 3 young foreigners seemed terribly friendly. But that aside, there was another slight hitch in the plans for the second phase. This stage of the exams was set to last 5 days, and no one had really expected any of the contestants to pass so soon. This left the exam proctors with a headache and a half. Genma Shirani glowered at a younger, mousy-haired Chunin, flicking an irritable sidelong glance at one of the gates in the fence surrounding Training Ground 44. "What do you mean the quarters aren't ready yet?" he drawled, chewing on a samban. Those preparations were supposed to have been finished before the exam even started. He gave the young man a piercing look, causing him to gulp nervously. Well, Satoshi said he was on that, the feckless assistant mumbled. But then I guess he got called out on a patrol mission, and I think he'd asked Kasumi to do something about it for him. But then her grandmother got sick, so she asked Aoba, but he was busy in TNI, so he shunted it off onto Shinji, and he asked Akane-chan to cover him when an important assignment came up, and well. Genma crossed his arms over his chest. "Let me guess," he drawled. "Then she wasn't able to do it either, so she asked someone else. Right?" The lad gulped. "Why yes sir, Genma sir. Takashi and Son were in charge of it after that, and I guess it must have just slipped their minds." Genma shook his head, exasperated. "I see," he sighed. "Kid, I'ma ask you a dumb question, and I hope you answer it honestly. This is important, okay? I don't want you lying to me, because then we would have a problem." He narrowed his eyes, leaning forward an inch or 2. "And I don't want us to have a problem. Capice?" The mousy-haired ninja paled at the glint of steel in his senior's eyes, and he nodded frantically. Why yes sir, of course," he squeaked. Genma took in a slow breath, and shook his head ponderously, peering once more at the forest of death beyond the fence, an area which was presently off-limits to effectively everyone but the exam participants. "If you knew these preparations weren't being completed," he drawled, pinning the lad to the spot with a gimlet eye. "And don't try to say that you didn't," he added in a warning tone. But if you knew that these people weren't getting their assigned tasks done, then why didn't you do anything to make sure it got done?" The young Chunin went a bright shade of pink, and he nervously averted his eyes. It wasn't my job, sir," he managed to squeak out, clearly abashed. Genma pinched the bridge of his nose. "Oh, for the love of," he shook his head with a long-suffering sigh. No, of course it wasn't." He dismissed the assistant with a wave of his hand, turning to glare daggers at the forest. Genma Shirani hated the Chunin exams. He really, truly did. It was just embarrassing how terrible most shinobi were at planning proper events. They just couldn't seem to wrap their heads around using their brains for anything that wasn't a mission. It was like trying to herd cats, or getting Academy first years to do a serious production of Romeo and Juliet. Most shinobi were just completely hopeless when it came to this sort of thing. Raids were no problem. Sting operations were easy as pie. Covert ops and assassination were their bread and butter. But the Chunin exams? Oh, those never failed to get even the cleverest of ninja running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Places for visiting Shinobi needed to be arranged, resources set aside for the preparation and execution of the various tests, and the Undertaker squad was still miffed about the Forest of Death being locked down while the second stage of the exam was on, and reams upon reams of paperwork to sign, file, notarize, etc. It was enough to make Ginma's head spin, and that wasn't even getting started on all the manpower that needed to be diverted from missions in order to prep and proctor the separate tests and up patrols within the village. It was a logistical nightmare, even if local businesses tended to do quite well with all of the foreign visitors looking for places to eat or buy extra supplies. Hell, it was worse than the Olympics. At least those didn't involve hordes of superpowered pubescent idiot savants and autistic little psycho killers running helter-skelter through the heart of a national military power center. Genma fiddled with the acupuncture needle in his mouth, a nervous tic that betrayed his frustration. These exams are gonna be a total pain in my ass, I just know it, he grumbled peevishly. After a moment of staring at the sign hanging over the gate and the chain-link fence, a sign labeled with the numeric designation of these particular training grounds, he shook his head and turned to leave. Whatever, he said mulishly. It ain't my problem. Enko and her lackeys can deal with it. He vanished in a swirl of leaves, with a sound like the wind. Enko barely managed to cover her mouth in time to keep from sneezing all over her plate of dango. Well, she sniffed, wiping her nose on the back of her sleeve. Someone must be talking about me. Probably one of my many admirers. She grinned and snorted noisily, flicking a bit of mucus off of her finger and into her guest's tea. Ibiki stared balefully at the off-yellow chunk of a hem, nasal debris now drifting in his chamomile. I can't imagine why, he said dryly, looking Enko squarely in the eye. She laughed. Sure you can't, she said, puffing out her fishnet-clad chest and winking. But loads of guys are really sweet to me. Reckon it's my winning personality that does it, that, of course, and my brilliant mind. Enko popped a trio of sweet dumplings off of their stick and into her mouth, chewing for a second before taking a swig of her own tea. She gulped the mess down with a sigh, grinning toothily before plucking up another used dango stick and tossing it over her shoulder without even looking. The dozen or so skewers she had already embedded in the wall looked like the beginnings of a leaf symbol. Ibiki spared an unamused look for the callow display, before he turned back to Enko with a snort. Yes, I'm sure that's it exactly, he drawled, sparing a disinterested glance for the seemingly transparent form-fitting mesh which comprised most of his friend and colleague's outfit. He wrinkled his nose when he saw Enko smirk and languidly stretch, slyly catching his eyes below her neckline and leaning forward over the table. Like what you see? She teased, batting an eyelash in a theatrically exaggerated wink. Ibiki chortled despite himself, rolling his eyes and dumping his ruined tea over the side. I've seen better, he replied dismissively, effortlessly meeting his friend's eye. Enko let out a most unladylike guffaw. As have I, I'm sure. She chortled, looking him playfully up and down. You aren't exactly a looker yourself, Ibiki. Yet I dare say I'm still a damn sight handsomer than half those punks in the exams, he wryly rejoined. I dunno, there are some very pretty ones in the mix this time around, Enko teased. That Uchiha boy could probably pull off a dress and make up maybe a curly blonde wig. Her eyes glimmered with mischief. Ibiki snorted. That's one of Kakashi's students, isn't it? Uchiha Sasuke, I believe his name was. Yup, and I reckon that twerp's probably one of my newest admirers by now. Ibiki raised an eyebrow at Enko's playful tone, and at the impish gleam in her eyes. Oh? And just what did you do to the boy? He asked, eyeing her a mite suspiciously. Enko was boisterous and fun-loving without much sense of propriety, plus a healthy dose of twisted ethics from being trained as a child soldier from practically as soon as she was old enough to write her own name. Usually, she knew better than to traumatize the rookies, but sometimes things got a little out of hand, and well. Enko shrugged off his concerns and waved an airy hand. Just a peck on the cheek and a bit of squeeze play is all it came to, she said dismissively. I meant to get him with my usual scare tactic, as I'm sure you know, but he caught the knife and pointed it at my head. So I had to improvise. Ibiki caught the smirk on Enko's face as she said this. He resisted the urge to sigh. Last I checked, Enko, the boy was still only 12. Don't try to harass him too much, okay? He shook his head. Intimidation is one thing, but people are going to have words for you if you make a habit of going around and kissing prepubescent boys. Anko snorted and rolled her eyes. Friggin' Nancy's, she griped. Concerned parent groups and moral effing guardians. If they had their way, our genin wouldn't even leave their diapers till they were 35. They can't honestly expect us to keep babying the ankle biters, can they? Ibiki gave Anko a measured look. Shinobi or not, Anko, most of them are still children, he told her carefully. Even if they've been trained to kill, there are just some lines that shouldn't be crossed. Legally speaking, if nothing else. Aha, said Anko mulishly. And as long as we don't cross those lines, we can continue to maintain our delusion of moral superiority, right? She scoffed. Come on, pal, don't give me that tripe and try to call it prime rib. There's a difference between doing the right thing and being a damn prude. Ibiki groaned and shook his head. Now, really, he sighed. Can we please not start this? Not today, at least. Please, Anko, I'd really rather not get into another of those debates. It's been a hell of a day for me already. Anko narrowed her eyes, but she said nothing and drained the last of her tea. After a moment of silence, she set the cup back down and shook her head, seeming to deflate at least partially. Bah, whatever, she muttered. It's been a long day for me, too. You know, I don't think anyone actually got to setting up the temporary quarters in the tower? For the teams who finish early, you mean? Ibiki said. That can't be right. Wasn't Ginma's group supposed to handle that? They're setting up for the third phase, Anko replied. Preparing the invitations to be sent out and all that, and making sure there'll be proper accommodations for the guests in the month leading up to the final stage. I think Hade had the tower. Hade, is that Yugao's beau? Ibiki said, a hint of recognition crossing his scarred face. Yeah, it's Loverboy, all right. Anko nodded. She rolled her eyes. Bleh. I mean, I get that he's sweet on her and all, but does he really need to fill the margins of his progress reports with all that lovey-dovey crap? I could have gone the rest of my life without seeing that half-finished poem about how everything from the shape of her eyes to the color of her hair makes him want to kiss her senseless. Sounds like he's a proper romantic, Ibiki dryly remarked. Anko grunted disinterestedly. They sat quietly for a moment, stewing in a thoughtful silence. The proprietor came over and brought them their bill, sparing a distasteful look for the dirty skewers Anko had embedded in the wall behind her, which the two jounins split 50-50. Then the pair of them stood and left the small dango shop, resuming their discussion on the unlikely subject of Hate and Yugao's relationship. Anko was convinced it was only a matter of time before Hate proposed. He had that look in his eye, she said, of a man possessed by the spirits of all that is sappy and pink. Ibiki was pleasantly surprised by this statement, and he mused that they were getting to an age where members of their generation were starting to pair off and think about settling down. Anko snorted, expressing her disagreement quite colorfully. She ranted about stupid couples and stupid romance and stupid cupids, vehemently declaring that she was quite sick of it all, and that she personally felt the world would be much better off with far fewer lovers in it. She vocally decried all things fluffy, frilly, and sweet, insisting that she would be happiest if she never again happened to cross paths with so much as a single happy couple. Meandering through a quiet and wooded part of the village, Ibiki Marino and Anko Mitarashi made quite an unlikely pair as they chatted and joked beneath the sun-dappled canopy on this pleasant day as upwards of 60 Chunin hopefuls fought for their lives in the forest of death. She was quite passionate about the subjects she cared about, filled with energy and verve, while he spoke slowly and precisely with a deep, gruff baritone. Somehow or other, the topic of their discussion went from couples in general to young couples in particular. Anko had some oddly specific words to say about randy little raven-haired brats and their precocious pinkette teammates, and Ibiki wasn't sure how much of her talk was amusement, and how much was annoyance. Apparently young Sasuke had taken a fancy to his female teammate, Sakura Haruno, a name which Ibiki vaguely recalled from the first phase of the exam. After a moment's thought, he was able to place it. He remembered finding a most interesting drawing on the back of that girl's test sheet. When he mentioned this to Anko, the woman laughed and offhandedly made a quip about Randy, precocious little runts. Ibiki secretly agreed with her sentiment, and absently he wondered what had happened to that particular paper. That Sakura girl was a remarkably talented artist. But before their conversation could progress any further, the two Chunin exam proctors found themselves quite rudely interrupted. Anko, Ibiki! A patrolman shouted, leaping down in front of them. Terrible news, you won't be happy to hear this. 3 corpses have been found in the graveyard. He shuddered and weakly shook his head, looking faintly ill as he caught his breath. I really think you two should probably take a look at them. This is, well, it's like nothing I've ever seen. Not a pretty sight. Anko frowned, eyeing the Chunin curiously at these words. I should think a graveyard usually has bodies in it, she remarked, although there was an unusually steely glint in her eyes. Ibiki frowned, and a hand went to a hidden pocket in his trench coat. How fresh are they? Any idea on the cause of death, or ID of the victims? He inquired, joining Anko as they followed the Chunin into a body flicker. I assume this is more than just a matter of some derelict or drug addict dropping dead in a public venue, if you deem it necessary to inform us. The patrolman didn't answer right away. Definitely less than a day old, he said eventually. An NBU coroner will probably be on the scene shortly, but I'd say they can't have been there more than a couple of hours. We'll probably get an official COD then, but it's not hard to guess the general cause, and yeah, I figured it would be prudent to let you guys know, since the bodies. He paused for a moment, and his face flickered with an unidentifiable emotion. Well, you'll see what I mean when we get there. He turned, and gestured for the 2 exam proctors to follow him. Anko hummed thoughtfully, and shared a look with Ibiki. They nodded, and their expressions darkened. As one, the 3 of them vanished into the treetops. The tower at the center of the Forest of Death had a gloomy, dismal feel to it. Lights were flickering on and off, the hum of a sputtering, inadequately maintained generator somewhere in the basement level resounding through the painfully silent structure. Seal tags and talismans of nearly forgotten purpose were slapped at seemingly random intervals on the walls and pillars, which were cracked and stained from years of alternate use and disuse. It had an atmosphere of isolation, a sense of being cut off from the rest of the world. This tower was located at the heart of the single most wild and savage area in the vast, sprawling woods for which this part of Hai no Kuni was famously known, and was not often in use. Typically it was just a rest stop for the higher-ranked shinobi who actually used Training Ground 44 for training. With so few people in it, naturally the tower felt empty, and the silence was nearly oppressive. This eerie tranquility seemed sacrosanct, in a way, as though to break the quietude of this place would be taboo, and would result in a dire retribution being visited upon their heads if they dared to speak, or otherwise make any noise of any kind. So, of course, Naruto had no problem loudly and cheerfully greeting a certain Suna. Yo, Gaara! How's it hanging? The blonde walked up to the redhead, grinning broadly and waving in salutation. He seemed utterly unconcerned with anything, and did not look as though he even feared for his life in Gaara's presence. Kankuro and Temari, from a far corner of the dimly lit hallway, gaped at the blonde and exchanged worried glances with each other, before inching even further away from their brother. Nothing much had happened since their rather unpleasant trip through the forest, and they'd mostly spent the past couple hours trying to keep an eye on their youngest sibling while at the same time staying well out of his way. Gaara turned to stare unblinkingly at Naruto, dull turquoise eyes disinterestedly assessing the orange-clad lad. Darkly ringed eyes gazed out from an expressionless face, a hairless brow branded with a blood-red tattoo of the kanji for love. Why are you talking to me? Gaara rasped, his voice low and laden with a quiet menace. His eyes narrowed. I have no interest in your company. Go away, if you value your life. Temari and Kankuro held their breaths. The former tried to distract herself by mentally reciting all 100 principles of shinobi conduct. The latter closed his eyes tightly and went to his happy place where busted, scantily clad Kunoichi oiled and polished his puppets. Naruto grinned at Gaara, unperturbed. "'Cause I feel like it," he said bluntly in response to the question. He scratched the back of his neck then, letting out a laugh. "And while I do like living, I reckon I don't have anything much to fear from you. Haha, no offense, of course." Gaara crossed his arms. "Humph. You must be as foolish as you look," he said. "Yes, so I've been told." Naruto laughed. "And you look like a violent street punk. But appearances can be deceiving, can't they?" The blonde's eyes twinkled, and he took a small step towards Gaara. Despite everything logic told him, in spite of all past experience and present assessments of the boy before him, Gaara found himself reflexively, automatically taking a step back almost as soon as Naruto advanced. His heartbeat quickened for a fraction of a second, and he felt a thrill of something he dimly supposed might be fear. The smile hadn't left Naruto's face, but in that moment the air felt unbearably thick between them, and a massive weight bore down on Gaara's head. He found himself unable to meet Naruto's gaze, bowing his head to look at the other boy's toes. Temari gaped at the sight before her. It was utterly inexplicable. Had she not known better, she might have thought that this loudmouth had somehow cowed her youngest brother. But that was impossible, wasn't it? She shook her head, deciding that she must simply be imagining things, and sharply elbowed Kankuro in the ribs. Her middle brother had a rather dopey expression on his face. Doubtless he had gotten a little bit too wrapped up in his happy place. Kankuro gave a strangled yelp, and shot Temari a dirty look. She gave him a stern glare in return, and he sheepishly folded without another word. They moved further away from Gaara, turning their backs and tiptoeing down the hall, figuring that whatever should happen next, it would be useful for them to be able to claim plausible deniability. Perhaps they can, Gaara muttered at length, after several seconds of silence had passed. He still found himself inexplicably incapable of meeting Naruto's gaze, and his lips twitched infinitesimally downward at the corners, curling minutely into something not unlike a frown. With some effort, he hardened his gaze and raised his eyes to look Naruto straight on. There was something deep to those eyes, he realized. They gleamed with a soft light, a warm and gentle compassion like he had seen in Uncle Yashimaru's eyes. They were kind yet firm, caring and forgiving. Blank and lifeless, frozen in terror and hate, glaring sightlessly at him from the shadows of memory and fear in the darkest corners of his mind, always staring, always piercing, always judging. Always and forever, that stare would be burned indelibly into his mind, into his dry and shriveled heart. It burned him, it froze him, he could not bear that gaze, but it would not be averted for anything. Not until he had paid for the sin that was his very existence, not unless he assuaged his mother's hate, quenched her parched and cracked lips with warm, sweet, worthy blood. Gaara felt an urge to shudder, but he suppressed it. His hands were trembling, however. "You're lonely, aren't you?" Naruto whispered insightfully, his stare piercing. He nodded. "Yeah, I know you are. I can see it in your eyes. They're just like mine used to be," the blonde whispered, and for a moment Gaara could not help but see his uncle. Sand hissed and rattled in his gourd, the cork threatening to pop, to flood and bury the hall in. "Believe me, man," Naruto continued, as though oblivious to the danger he was in. "I know where you're coming from. I know that feels so hard. It hurts worse than anything else, doesn't it? It gets you right here, right in the goddamn kokoro. When everyone refuses to acknowledge your existence, well, that just plain sucks ass, doesn't it?" Something in Gaara snapped at these words. His eyes flashed, and he saw nothing but red. Sand erupted from his gourd, crashing into the walls and cascading down the hall in a thunderous cacophony of motion. "Don't talk like you understand," he roared with all the venom and bile of an angsty teenager, his voice cracking and going hoarse from the sheer volume of his shout. "You don't know me. No one understands my pain. Just shut up and die." In the blink of an eye, Gaara's sand filled the hallway before him from floor to ceiling. Walls groaned under the strain, bending outwards and threatening almost to buckle. Gaara twitched psychotically, growling and snarling. There was no way the blonde could have escaped that, he told himself. Naruto was, beyond any shadow of a doubt, surely buried in the heart of this flood. Looking absolutely livid, Gaara held out his hand and savagely curled it into a fist. With a sound like a thunderclap, the hall imploded. Enough sand to bury a full platoon of shinobi collapsed into a singular point, a perfect sphere of no greater than half a meter in diameter. Not a single grain littered the floor, every ounce of his resources committed into this surefire killing blow. There was no way the blonde could have survived that. Letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, Gaara let his arm fall, and the spherical coffin of imploded sands collapsed. For a moment, he felt almost relieved, a rare catharsis that came with his most satisfying kills. Then a finger tapped him on the shoulder. What's up, Gaara?" came Naruto's cheeky voice. "You see a fly on my shoulder, or something? That was some serious overkill just to swat a bug." Gaara blinked. It took all of his willpower to fight the urge to cry tears of rage. Sakura was glowing with contentment as she and Sasuke slumped to the floor, sweaty and panting and flush with exertion. They were fully clothed and not at all disheveled, but there was nonetheless an unmistakable air satisfaction about them. Sasuke's Sharingan was extinguished, silver, sable, and scarlet orbs having dimmed into a uniform, unpatterned black. He was smiling gently, his chest rising and falling with pleasantly labored breaths as he gazed at his wife with a soft and subtly passionate intensity. His face was ruddy, brow glistening with sweat as though he had just run a marathon. Sakura was beaming radiantly, smiling wide and humming a tuneless melody to herself as she reclined against her husband. She nestled her chin into the crook of his neck, lazily inhaling the fragrance of his sweat, the musky perfume of Sasuke Uchiha. His arm was wrapped loosely around her waist, and she was idly caressing his knee. "That was magnificent," she purred, melting blissfully into his tender embrace. A giggle escaped her. "Tsukuyomi is just as useful as I remember." Sasuke nodded absent-mindedly, bathing in the afterglow of illusionary ahem, bonding between him and his wife. "I can't believe I'd forgotten about that particular application," he admitted, lazily rubbing a hand up and down Sakura's waist. "Well, now, we were pretty distracted," Sakura said defensively. "What with everything that was going on." That's true," Sasuke hummed, nodding. He leaned a little more into Sakura, not particularly caring all that much about anything but him and her in that moment. They were cuddled up together in this out-of-the-way room, uncaring of whether or not anyone happened to come across them. 72 hours of mutual mind-screwing could do a lot for relieving stress. So, of course, neither of them were terribly upset when Kankuro and Temari stumbled into the room with fearful expressions. Sasuke and Sakura were too absorbed in sitting there and enjoying one another's presence to raise a fuss about any interlopers. The two non-Jinchuriki-san siblings, in contrast, were flabbergasted when they saw the pair snuggled up so intimately. Sure, the kids were fully dressed, and sure their clothes didn't have the disheveled or careless look of clothing tossed back in place after an NC-17 encounter, but Temari and Kankuro weren't idiots. They could tell, from the expression on the kids' faces and the way that they held one another, that obviously something had happened between them. Had they been less intent on fleeing their psychotic younger brother, Temari might have felt torn between envying these brats who could afford to be so lovey-dovey and scorning this grossly unprofessional behavior, and Kankuro probably would have scowled and felt annoyed that even 13-year-olds were getting more action than him. As it was, both still muttered rather darkly for a moment before turning around and beginning to barricade the door with whatever they could get their hands on. Sasuke shot an irritable look at the two siblings, reluctantly tearing his eyes away from Sakura. "Didn't anyone ever teach you two to knock?" he muttered, giving them the stink eye. Sakura pouted, feeling Sasuke move, and reluctantly she let go of him. He stood up, and for a moment she contemplated taking advantage of the fact that this left her at eye level with his zipper. At the very least, it might make the interloping Sannin uncomfortable enough to leave of their own accord. But then Sasuke stepped towards Kankuro and Temari, and Sakura lost her chance to act. With a "what can you do?" sort of shrug, she stood up and glanced at the makeshift barrier the duo had erected across the doorway. It actually looked decently sturdy for something thrown together from sparse and disparate pieces of furniture, and she mused that it could probably stymie a normal genin for at least a few minutes. "What's with the barricade?" she innocently inquired. Kankuro peered at her over his shoulder, a wild and hunted look in his eye. "Gaara's gone berserk," he hissed. "He almost got us with that last attack if we hadn't already left the hallway." He shuddered. "What, is that all?" Sasuke said, distinctly unimpressed. He harumphed. "Please. He's not that scary." Temari shook her head. "No, believe me, it'll be a lot safer if we just sit tight and wait for this to die down. Gaara's in a whole other league from ordinary shinobi, but as long as we stay out of the way, he shouldn't feel any need to kill us." "Really, we should probably be throwing the two of you to him," Kankuro muttered darkly, "since it was your teammate who set Gaara off. Maybe killing you lovebirds will be enough to satisfy him." "Absolutely not," Temari snapped, silencing her brother with an icy look. "Yeah, that's not a very nice thing to say," Sakura added, frowning at Kankuro. Kankuro glowered hotly, and Sakura slowly shook her head. It was a bit surreal to hear the puppeteer suggesting that she and Sasuke be sacrificed to his baby brother, considering how she had saved Kankuro's life in another time after he chased after that very same brother when he got abducted by Akatsuki, only to wind up getting beaten and poisoned by the very man who'd created most of the puppets Kankuro ever used. Of course, he had never exactly been the most genial fellow to begin with, but still. She mentally shrugged this off and looked over at Sasuke, who was boredly assessing the makeshift barricade. "You won't keep him out with this, you know," he commented dryly. "Honestly, I doubt a barrier that flimsy would work on anyone who makes it all the way to this tower." Temari flushed and shot the raven-haired tween a dirty look. "Oh, what do you know?" she sniped, folding her arms under her chest. This gesture earned the blonde a faintly jealous look from Sakura, who glanced ruefully down at her own rather lacking bust, and scowled. "More than you," Sasuke deadpanned with a wry smirk. Kankuro snorted at this, quite obviously biting back a laugh. "And I reckon Sakura knows even more than I do." He shot his wife a grin, and she tore her gaze from Temari's teenaged rack. Sakura's expression brightened considerably, and she returned the smirk with interest. "Flatterer," she said, shoving him playfully on the shoulder of his missing arm. "What am I ever going to do with you, Sasuke?" He smirked, before feigning an innocent expression. "Oh, I don't know," he drawled. "I'm sure you have a few ideas." Sakura laughed, catching the glint in his eye. "You're a very naughty boy, aren't you?" she chortled. A wink. "Yes, I suppose I can think of a couple ways to punish someone like you, handsome." Kankuro gagged exaggeratedly. "Ugh, get a room, you two," he groaned. "That's just disgusting." Temari looked like she dearly wished to nod in agreement, but then she suddenly whipped her head around to stare at the barricaded door. Frowning and narrowing her eyes, she raised a finger to her lips and hissed at the other three, before pointing to her ear and then at the door. The sound of footsteps soon became audible, and all 4 current occupants of that room went silent. Sasuke and Sakura were trading bemused looks, and Kankuro had gone deathly pale beneath his war paint. Tap. 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 The footsteps came closer, growing louder and clearer the nearer they walked. Sandals clapped on the tile floor, their owner, or more likely owners, judging by the frequency and timing of steps, making no attempt to move silently or disguise their presence. Sasuke pursed his lips, listening carefully. He held up his hand and raised 2 fingers, looking at Sakura and arching an eyebrow as if to silently ask for her opinion. The pinkette frowned and nodded for a moment, before pausing. Her eyes narrowed, and then she shook her head, raising a hand of her own and putting up 3 fingers. Sasuke appeared skeptical for a moment, but only a moment. He perked up, listening to the uneven tempo of the approaching footsteps, and a look of realization crossed his face. His mouth opened in a silent ah, and he nodded in understanding. He gestured briefly with his one hand in an obscure, altered form of ANBU sign language, a modified lexicon that had originally been devised by Danzo Shimura for the purpose of discreetly conveying orders to his root operatives. Fingers curled into a fist before splaying out, twisting and flexing into a few complex arrangements. Sakura's response came in a more standard mode, hands quickly blurring through a brief sequence of signs. Kankuro and Temari, who had by this point noticed the silent exchange, were only able to catch the tail end of the conversation, not that it did them any good, since neither one actually knew sign language. Sasuke seemed mollified by whatever it was Sakura told him, however, and he smirked and turned toward the door once more. The footsteps came to a stop just outside the room. "Hello, have any of you seen a snake come through here?" A voice came through the door. "I ran into one in the forest, but it got away before I could catch it." Temari and Kankuro seemed suitably freaked out when the realization struck that these words were almost certainly directed at them, even if the tone of the one speaking sounded quite harmless and gentle. Sasuke and Sakura, in contrast, smiled knowingly. A male voice muttered something venomous about underhanded tactics, and a deeper voice chimed in with a vaguely passive-aggressive comment. "Hello, Hinata," chirped Sakura, leaning up to the door. "I'm afraid to say that we haven't seen hide or scale of any snakes, though Naruto sensed your run-in earlier. He was in a real tizzy over it, actually. Our little buddy got really torn up over whether to run over and help you out." Hinata Hyuga, the unseen speaker, giggled at this. "He did he?" she said, sounding pleasantly amused. Oh, that Naruto, what am I ever going to do with him? Another laugh. Although he does make a very dashing knight in shining armor, I must admit. He could probably help me track the snake down, too, but it looks like he and Gaara-san, was it? Well, it seems those two are busy having a heart-to-heart chat at the moment. I'd rather not interrupt. Sasuke hummed thoughtfully. I see, he said, ignoring Kankuro and Temari's flabbergasted expressions. And by heart-to-heart you mean? There was a brief pause. He's giving Gaara and Shikaku a sermon on friendship, while Kurama holds them down, Hinata finally answered. Sasuke and Sakura gave a sympathetic wince. Ah, that's what you mean, said the latter. I almost feel sorry for the poor bastards, mused the former. Temari and Kankuro gaped disbelievingly. Sharing a look, they simultaneously voiced the only statement they could actually consciously formulate in response to these recent, wildly unbelievable statements. What? Gaara wasn't sure where, exactly, he was. Before his eyes a vast and seemingly endless plain of white stretched out, so pure and clear that he could find no distinction between the firmament above and the ground, or at least he thought it was the ground, below. There was no telling where one ended and the other began, no clear horizon or terminating line. It was enough to give a lesser person vertigo, though Gaara was either sure enough in his sense of balance to trust that he wouldn't suddenly tumble and fall into what he thought was the sky, or else so damn estranged from reality that he didn't give a rat's ass one way or another. Gaara wasn't quite sure how he had arrived in this place. The last thing he remembered was the grinning face of that obnoxious blonde, before hands of golden flames swept aside his sand shield and wrapped around his body. Somehow Naruto had gotten past his defenses and pinned him down without breaking a sweat. Yet he didn't feel like he was being held in place, here, wherever he may have been. He was free to move his arms and legs, although he hesitated to do so. A part of him worried maybe that if he moved from this spot he would get swiftly lost and become unable to return whence he had come. An irrational fear, perhaps or perhaps not. He had no way to be certain. Is this a genjutsu? He wondered aloud, his voice surly and gruff, still freshly remembering how a certain Konoha ninja had so effortlessly evaded his killing move. Not really, came the unexpected answer, and Gaara stiffened at the sound of this voice. He whipped his head around to see a man with short, spiky blonde hair and whisker marks on his cheeks, a man who looked almost like a grown-up Naruto Uzumaki. A man who just so happened to be seated atop the head of a monstrous, nine-tailed yuko which had its massive, clawed and furry hands clasped together in a perverse mimicry of prayer. It was a mildly surreal sight, even by the standards of the ninja world. Gaara blinked. His eyes closed for only the briefest moment. When they reopened, he found himself back in the hall once more, held in place by those inexplicable hands of chakra. The shift was not at all disorienting, oddly enough, and the giant fox monster was no longer anywhere to be seen. He felt a pricking in his forehead though, and a violent thrumming beneath his seal. Shikaku was pissed. Dimly, Gaara noticed that his sand was lying uselessly on the ground. He tried commanding it to move, but it didn't respond. Not so much as a grain was budged, no matter how adamantly he willed otherwise. Yeah, your jutsu's not gonna work, Naruto spoke up. I'm jamming it for the time being, otherwise we'd never be able to have a civil conversation. Gaara stared at the other boy, disbelief evident in the infinitesimal widening of his eyes. Jamming? He repeated. His tone would have been skeptical if he hadn't just spent the last few seconds quite fruitlessly trying to move even the slightest mote of his sand. Yeah, Naruto said easily. Don't worry, it's only temporary. Like I said earlier, I just want to talk. That would be kind of difficult to do with you trying to kill me. Gaara's expression darkened. I have no interest in talking, he growled. Well, that's just fine. Naruto waved a hand airily. All I really need for you to do is sit there and hear me out, and I'm sure you can do at least that much. A stony face was his only response. The blonde smiled coolly, undeterred, and continued on. See, now, I know you've been having a hard time with things, Gaara, he said, meeting the redhead's eyes. I get where you're coming from. I know what it's like when people refuse to acknowledge your existence. Believe me, I've been there, done that, and bought that t-shirt. It's painful, and it can be so hard to make sense of things. Feeling like you don't have any reason to exist. He trailed off, staring grimly into the middle distance. Gaara stared blankly at Naruto, apparently determined not to betray any emotion on his face. One of his fingers twitched, as though reflexively trying once more to command his hand, but otherwise he did nothing. Well, nothing good ever comes out of that kind of thinking. People will gladly do any number of stupid, irrational, horrible things if they think it might somehow validate their existence. When a person is at such a low point that life seems completely meaningless, they get desperate, afraid. I've seen good, kind-hearted folks fall in with the worst sorts in an attempt to belong. I've seen people who've been hurt too many times try to push away everyone around them. Naruto paused, stepping forward and placing a hand on Tsunagenin's shoulder. Neither of those is a healthy response, Gaara. Shikaku's couldn't help flinching at the contact, and the words which accompanied it. He glared at Naruto, eyes cold and steely. "What do you know?" he growled. "A lot of things," Naruto said with a dismissive shrug. "Like how your mother really did love you." Those words elicited an immediate response from Gaara, one which Naruto probably expected. Turquoise eyes flashed venomously, and an arm came up in a sudden movement, breaking free of Kurama's grasp for the briefest of moments. A fist collided with Naruto's nose, digging into his face with an ugly crunching sound. The blonde took it without flinching, looking unblinkingly into Gaara's eyes. He did not step back or look away. "Ow," Naruto commented once Gaara withdrew his fist, blood pouring from his nose like a faucet. "Da's a Hiluba right hook." He gently grasped Gaara's fist and guided it down back to the redhead's side, where the redhead let it hang limply. With his other hand, Naruto casually grabbed his nose and yanked it back into alignment, pinching the bridge for a moment to stem the bleeding. Gaara stared blankly, shivering a little as he realized what he had just done. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually lashed out at someone with his bare hands, if he had ever even done so once in all his life. He blinked owlishly, looking absently down at his fist. He could see a bit of drying blood on his knuckles. "I punched you," he said faintly, his voice a hint of tremulousness. "Yup, that you did," Naruto said, snorting crudely and spitting a mouthful of blood, snot, and spit onto the floor beside him. He made a face, then, crossing his eyes and doing something that might have been an attempt to wiggle his nose. "Does this look like it's healed straight to you?" Gaara stared at Naruto, who was pointing to his nose. It honestly looked a tiny bit crooked, although certainly not enough to raise a big fuss over. At a loss for what else to say, and still a bit in shock over actually having resorted to physically punching someone, Gaara weakly shook his head. Naruto frowned at this for a moment, before grinning and giving a shrug. "Oh, well, I suppose I can have Sakura re-break it for me later," he said dismissively. Once more he screwed up his face and looked cross-eyed down his nose. "Damn, still can't wiggle it." "Were you able to before?" Gaara heard himself ask. He felt a touch lightheaded. "Nah," Naruto said, "but I figured getting it broken might have given me the ability. You never know, right?" The absurdity of this comment combined with the perfectly serious way Naruto had said it left Gaara once more at a loss for words. Again, the redhead looked down at his fist, the knuckles of which were dyed with the same dull, flaking red as Naruto's upper lip. He curled and uncurled his fingers, curiously flexing them. "I'm sorry." The words were spoken hoarsely, uncertainly, his voice sounding like the hinges of a long-unused door being tentatively creaked open for the first time in decades. Gaara almost didn't realize that he was the one speaking, the half-hearted apology coming tumbling out of his mouth seemingly of its own accord. His knuckles twinged strangely as he unconsciously flexed his fingers again, and the redhead winced, his other hand coming up to clasp his bloodied fist. He looked stunned, disbelieving at the strange sensation which was shooting through his hand. It was jarring, and his teeth grit together as his breath came out in a hiss. Naruto laughed, seeing the almost horrified expression on Gaara's face. "Your fist hurts?" he asked casually. Hey, sorry about that, man. Sasuke's always said I have a hard head." He gave another laugh at this little joke. Gaara whipped his head up to stare at Naruto. "Hurt?" he whispered, parroting the word curiously. "Is this pain?" Naruto leaned in close and looked at Gaara's fist. With all the delicacy of a child brandishing a stick, he poked his fellow Jinchuriki's blood-stained knuckles. Gaara yelped and recoiled at this touch, leaning as far from Naruto as he could while still restrained by those giant, glowing hands. There was a touch of something wild and frightened in the redhead's eyes. Yeah, I'd reckon that's pain all right, Naruto concluded, nodding seriously. No surprise, really, with how hard you punched me. I'm sorry, Gaara blurted out once more, startling himself even more than the jolt of pain which had just gone through his knuckles. Naruto waved a hand airily, giving Gaara a toothy grin. Forget about it, he said dismissively. Compared to Sakura-chan, that was barely even a love tap. Gaara stared at Naruto like the blonde was the most bizarre thing he had ever seen in his entire life, and that probably wasn't too far off the mark. But you're bleeding, he said, flabbergasted. And you aren't, Naruto said. But that doesn't mean you're not hurting right now, does it? Somehow, Gaara got the impression that there was something very meaningful behind this statement, but he couldn't begin to imagine what that might be. He shook his head weakly, gingerly cradling his throbbing fist close to his chest. I don't understand you, he whispered. He grit his teeth. I should hate you. You're my enemy. I hate you, you should be the one in pain, so why am I hurting here? He clutched his chest with his uninjured hand, face contorting into something like a pained frown. As much as I am out here? He raised his blood-covered fist. It's more real, isn't it? Naruto said, looking into Gaara's eyes with that penetrating, unblinking stare of his. When you hurt people with your sand, you can remove yourself from what you're doing and pretend it doesn't have any effect on you, but fists don't lie. When we hurt others, we hurt ourselves just as much. Gaara stared at Naruto, clutching his injured hand. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Naruto smiled sympathetically and squeezed Gaara's shoulder. This pains you more than it does me, he whispered. I've gotten used to this kind of suffering, to physical pain. I've accepted it as a part of my life. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences hurt. A lot. You can't run from the truth, Gaara. Your fist knows it, your heart knows it. Is it always like this? Gaara mumbled. His shoulders heaved. Does it always hurt? You've never hit someone before, have you? Naruto said knowingly. Gaara shook his head. No, I've had my sand since I was born. My father taught me how to use it from the day I was old enough to walk. I can't remember ever not having it at my disposal, to protect me and to hurt others. It gets easy to hurt people when you can't feel what you're doing to them, Naruto observed. Sometimes I forget that myself. If you remove yourself from the act, throw a shuriken into their forehead from a distance, flick a kunai between their ribs without even looking them in the eye, well, it gets all too easy to distance yourself from the pain. To pretend it isn't there. He smiled softly, ruefully. That doesn't make it all right, though. And there are times when you can't do anything to lie to yourself, when you have no choice but to break the enemy's body with your own two hands to feel every blow you rain down on their form, and know exactly when their heartbeat stops. Seeing the light leave their eyes as pain surges through your body, it makes it real. I think that really drives home the gravity of it, the seriousness of taking a life. Gaara swallowed, looking nervously into Naruto's eyes. He saw the sincerity in those pools, saw the light dull and lessened with the weight of grim recollection. Naruto's eyes fell. Following his gaze, Gaara found himself looking at the blonde's hands. Perhaps it was only a trick of the flickering, fluorescent lights, but for a moment Gaara could have sworn that he could see the blood staining those hands. He looked back up into Naruto's eyes, feeling a strange, inexplicable kinship. You know what it's like, Gaara whispered. The loneliness, you really know exactly what it's like, don't you? Naruto smiled sadly. Like I said, he replied, I've been there, done that, and bought that t-shirt. He grabbed the hem of his jacket, lifting both it and the shirt underneath. Gaara stared at the spiral mark on the blonde's abdomen, and the twin runic arcs which encased it. Arcane sealing script like frozen black flames seared into his skin formed 8 radial spokes. He met Naruto's eyes, and understanding blossomed. We're the same, he whispered, scarcely daring to make the words audible. Naruto nodded. I've had this seal since the day I was born, he murmured. My mom died on the same day when my dad sealed the 9-tailed fox into my body. Gaara's eyes widened at these words. He looked like his heart had suddenly stopped beating. Naruto smiled wryly. I don't think our circumstances are exactly the same, but it's striking, isn't it? My dad sealed the into my body. He hoped it would make me strong. My mom, she didn't like that. She didn't want him to do it, and she tried to stop him. trying to convince him that there had to be another way. But there wasn't. For better or worse, it had to be done. My dad gave his life sealing Kurama inside me, and saved our village in the process. My mom died from her wounds, at the same time as my dad. Their last words. Naruto paused, sniffing once. His gaze was distant, filled with what Gaara could only describe as sorrowful nostalgia. Their last words were their wishes for me, their son what they wanted for me, what hopes they had for my future, the things I reckon every parent feels a need to tell their children. He smiled. I wonder if you've figured it out? I don't know how much they teach you in the Suno Academy, as far as the recent history of other villages. Gaara met Naruto's eyes. The fourth Hokage, he murmured. Yes, even in the sand, we know that story, and it seems that you and I have gone through many of the same ordeals. We suffered the same kind of loneliness, each in our own way. His expression hardened then, and now he spoke with a touch of defiance. But the reasons were different, as were the results. We are the same, but also nothing alike. Naruto squinted at Gaara. I wonder about that, he said, gingerly taking Gaara's injured fist in hand. He saw the redhead wince at the touch. Something tells me that our dad's motivations were a lot more similar than you might like to admit. People hurt themselves when they hurt others. But weapons don't feel anything. Are you trying to tell me we're not weapons? Gaara whispered, narrowing his eyes in turn. Maybe I'm simply faulty. I know why I was created. I know why my father had this demon sealed inside me. It was to serve and protect the village, Naruto finished for Gaara, right? That's the duty of all shinobi. Even the Kage must give their life, if it will mean safety and prosperity for their people and their village. That's their responsibility. Our responsibility. When I die, I intend to die as a man, as a proud shinobi of the Hidden Leaf, as the Lord Hokage, giving my life out of love for my home. He grinned toothily. I think it'll be the same for you, Gaara. In fact, I know it will. He clasped the redhead's shoulder. Gaara stared at Naruto, thunderstruck by the sincerity, the utter conviction behind this statement. You think I'll be Hokage? He said weakly, the words spilling out half of their own accord. Naruto laughed uproariously. Thanks, Gaara, he said, grinning from ear to ear. I needed that. I guess our conversation was getting a little too heavy, wasn't it? Gaara flushed. He hadn't meant for that statement to come out like a joke. I meant Kazekage, he half-heartedly insisted, looking almost sheepish as his usual stoic mask fell by the wayside. Naruto smiled, clapping him on the back. Sure you did, he said with a wink. Then he added, but yes, I think you will. Deep down, I know you have all of the qualities a good Kage needs. You just haven't realized it yet. And with that, he walked past Gaara, humming cheerfully. With a start, the redhead realized that he was no longer restrained by the chakra hands, and he got a vague feeling that he hadn't been so bound for a fair while. Just when had they dispelled? His finger twitched, and the sand at his feet responded. Slowly shaking his head, Gaara paused for a moment, seeming uncertain. Hesitantly, he looked back over his shoulder at Naruto's retreating form. There was a burning question at the back of his mind, and if he didn't get an answer now, he knew somewhere deep inside that he would not forgive himself for a very long time. How, he murmured hoarsely, swallowing and staring at Naruto's back. How can you be so sure my mother loved me? Naruto turned to look at Gaara. He was wearing a small yet brilliant smile. Because she was your mother, he said simply. She might have hated your father, the village, the demon, even the circumstances of your birth, but she could never hate you. That's just how moms are, I think. Gaara felt something catch in his throat, and his chest tightened uncomfortably. A hot pressure built up behind his eyes, and moisture began to stream down his cheeks, yet he somehow found it in himself to smile. Thank you, he whispered. His fist dully ached, and tears stung at his eyes, but Gaara could not remember the last time he had felt this happy. Even Shikaku didn't dare to sully the moment. Okay, seriously? That was so gay. Well, not too much, at least. Kurama was of the honest opinion that, most of the time, he was the only vaguely intelligent entity in the universe. Obviously humans were all half-wits, but Kurama was quite accustomed to their idiocy. He'd had enough experience with the foibles and failings of mortal men that he knew better than to expect too much out of them. Their stupidity could even be a little endearing at times, if he were to be honest with himself. Kurama, despite all his unknowable age and immeasurable power, had a certain weakness for underdogs, and were not humans, with their soft and delicate bodies, short and fleeting lifespans, and woefully limited senses and power, practically the very definition of underdogs. Most definitely, when matched against beings on his level. Humans who could go up against him despite knowing that it would almost certainly mean forfeiting their lives were most admirable, in the Kurama's opinion. People like Minato Namikaze garnered a fair deal of respect from the Nine-Tails. Anyone with the guts to fight against the impossible was worth high praise, as far as he was concerned. So perhaps humans were idiots, but they were the sorts of idiots you could find yourself wanting to root for. As long as they weren't like Madara or Hashirama. But Kurama could accept that humans were usually imbeciles. They had a lot working against them, after all, not least of which being their dreadfully short lifespans, such that even those few who did manage to acquire something akin to wisdom would invariably pass away in only a few short decades, and most likely be replaced by yet another dime a dozen yokel or slack-jawed dumbass. Much harder to swallow, however, was the knowledge that oftentimes his own siblings were just as pants-on-head retarded as the humans they were so unfairly forced to inhabit. Shikaku was living proof of this. Or at least inasmuch as a giant, sentient mass of chakra could really be considered alive. That was a point which philosophers and scientists could debate to their heart's content, particularly since Bijou couldn't die so much as dissipate, and even then they would inevitably reconstitute, after a certain length of time. But the fact that Shikaku was a mentally subnormal psychopath was indisputable. Or so Kurama would have one belief. You do know that your friend is going to regress the instant my esteemed brother is able to get in a couple hours of uninterrupted ranting, right? The drew within his host's mind, resting his chin on folded claws. Shikaku won't give an inch without being beaten within an inch of his life. That lunatic's even worse about humans than I used to be, and I was once known as the physical embodiment of hatred. You still are, in this time, Naruto quipped under his breath. And don't worry about Shikaku. Gaara was able to pretty much handle him for the 3 years between our battle during the Sand Sound invasion, and when he finally got debijoued by our cloaked friends, wasn't he? He's more resilient than you might expect, Kurama. That lecture of yours only sank in the last time around because Shikaku had been too drained from physically manifesting to badger Gaara in those first few days after the invasion. If the Sandrat has his way, your little buddy won't have so much as a single moment of silence in which to contemplate your words. You're assuming Shikaku will have a single moment of silence in which to pester Gaara, though, Naruto replied with a twinkle in his eye. Kurama didn't see his host's expression, but he could feel the all-too-familiar undercurrent of nearly vulpine mischief in the man-turned-boy's words. That tone never boded well for those who were foolhardy enough to oppose the one true master of mayhem and chicanery. He chuckled, tilting his head sideways in the open space of the seal's cape. Ah, so you're already working on that, are you? Naruto waved a hand with flourish. Just because I'd gotten used to having Shikamaru's brains at my disposal doesn't mean I can't still plan on my own, he said airily. I'm not that stupid. With a grin, he tapped his temple and sent a bit of chakra into the place where his mind and his father's seal met and blended together. Composition and hue were carefully chosen, an intuitive blending of simpler paints to create a precise and particular pigment, which he daubed ever so deliberately in place. Kurama grinned, recognizing the signal, and he proceeded to inconspicuously open the specific telepathic link between himself and the one-tailed tanuki. Naruto began to hum an infectiously upbeat-sounding tune, and Kurama overheard the garbled lyrics his host was beginning to mentally project to Shikaku. Fumikomu zi akusuru kakahiki wa nayase, so deo. Yora wa nukaru. Nejikomu sa seigo anai sashihiki 0 sa, so deo. Hibi wa kazuru. He snickered, recognizing the tactic as both underhanded and deceptively subtle. So much so that no one who wasn't intimately familiar with how the 7th Hokage worked would actually suspect it to be his doing. Even Bijou were not immune to getting songs stuck in their heads. When you open your heart a little, and pull someone close to you, your feelings will surely reach them deeper, yeah? Gaara cocked his head, wondering faintly if Shikaku had finally cracked. One moment the demon priest had been ranting right in his metaphorical ear about all the ways in which Naruto was a sentimental fool who wasn't even worth the sand it would take to crush him, and the next he had suddenly gone quiet. Hurry it up, ring it out, though my legs are all tangled, they will surely take me far even if I steal it and manage to grasp it. If it isn't you, then what's the point? That wasn't the strangest part, of course. After a moment of silence from the bijou, Shikaku had then started to hum. Gaara had never heard Shikaku hum. Ever. So I'll go far into the distance, and your world will become a thing of deceit painted all in white. And now, if the aforementioned hadn't been enough, the Ichibi was also apparently speaking complete gibberish. Vaguely meaningful gibberish, perhaps, but gibberish nonetheless. It was still infinitely preferable to the beast's usual raving, mind, no matter how used to all of that Gaara may have been, so he didn't afford the matter too much thought. This innocuous, vaguely musical-sounding babble faded much more easily into the background than demands for bloodshed, or threats to devour his soul the instant he allowed his guard to drop. Hit the gas, there's no need to finagle. Oh yeah, we'll go all through the night complaining at the end. The balance is 0. Oh yeah, we'll whittle the days away. Plus it was kind of catchy, if he were to be perfectly honest. Quite a ways away in the land of wind, the Lord Fourth Kazekage, Raza of the Gilded Sands, was not having a good day. He was pacing in his office and running his hands through sandy blonde hair, his brow furrowed from stress. He had postponed all meetings until further notice, that morning, saying in no uncertain terms that the first person to interrupt him could kiss their shinobi career goodbye. He stared intently, his face ashen and tightly drawn, at a sheet of paper clutched in his hand. It was creased and crinkled, having been folded and unfolded many times over, clenched between his fingers in a firm and steady grasp which did little to overtly betray the worry he felt in the pit of his stomach. Words were written on the paper in a hand that was both precise yet untidy, a brief but somewhat troubling message scrawled sharply down in black ink. Orochimaru is not trustworthy. He will kill you the instant you are of no further use to him. Play into his hands, and you will not live to see the invasion of Konoha. Seeing that he had found this letter on his pillow that morning, was it any wonder the Lord Kazekage should feel concerned by its contents? Really, it was bad enough that someone who wasn't Baki or one of his advisors apparently knew of Raza's plans to ally his village with Orochimaru, and he knew it hadn't come from them, because it did not match any of their handwriting samples, but for them to warn him in so forthright a manner of potential treachery? He ran his hands through his hair, silently fretting. Outside his window, he saw the village A and B going through triple their usual daily security exercises, half in punishment for the incompetence which allowed this letter to reach where he slept in the first place. If whoever delivered that letter had been an assassin, Suna would have found itself short one Kazekage this morning, and a mere month before the planned invasion of Konoha at that. And have to make sure that something like this wouldn't happen a second time. Raza felt acutely miserable as he contemplated the letter's contents. Might the note be an earnest warning from a disgruntled servant of the Snake Summoner? Or perhaps an attempt to sow additional distrust and sabotage the budding alliance between the Sand and Sound? It was no secret to him that Orochimaru was the founder and leader of the Hidden Sound village, and where there were any number of people acting under one banner, it would only be natural for dissident or rebellious elements to eventually take root. The letter might have also been planted by a Konoha spy. Orochimaru was a renegade from that village, and his activities would naturally be of interest to the Hokage or even certain other powers within the Leaf. And again, this message could either be an earnest warning, or an attempt to sabotage an alliance between Suna and Oto. It would, of course, be worrying if this letter really had come from anyone affiliated with the Leaf. If there was even the slightest chance that Konoha agents might have gotten wind of the invasion plan, he would need to reconsider everything. Right now, it seemed very likely that those plans would have to be called off. He took pride in his village's counterintelligence department, but ignoring the possibility of a leak or plant somewhere in the village's forces would be downright foolish. Especially when it would need to be quite high up for the fact of Orochimaru's participation to be known. Unless the man himself had planted that note as some sort of twisted test. Raza could not discount this possibility either. Orochimaru was renowned as a formidable shinobi, as much for his mastery of the ninja arts as for his duplicitous cunning. There was no telling what the man might be thinking, and it seemed entirely plausible that this letter might be from Orochimaru. To what end, Raza could not begin to fathom, but he didn't trust the Snake Summoner any further than he could throw him. And of course he was wary of Orochimaru. Raza would have to have been a fool not to be, and a fool would not have made it very far as Kazekage. He was used to looking over his shoulder and expecting a knife in the back at any moment, and he was not ignorant to the supposed curse on the position of Kazekage. All three of his predecessors had died at the hands of assassins. Although Sandame's body had never been found, it was generally accepted that he must have been killed, and the Lord Fourth had always been cautious just in case he wound up falling victim to the same fate. He knew that if anyone was capable of assassinating him, it would be Orochimaru of the Sannin. This had been a small part of his reasoning for entering into the secret alliance with Oto in the first place. Raza was a formidable shinobi, but strength in battle was little use if caught off guard, and he held no illusions as to the ability of his ANBU to keep someone as subtle and devious as Orochimaru out of his bedchambers. All it would take would be a poisoned dagger between the ribs while he slept. In its current state, Suna simply did not have the power to defend itself should someone like Orochimaru decide to destroy it. Where Konoha was strong and populated by many active shinobi, the hidden sand had been floundering and diminishing with only a small, inconstant trickle of new blood against the slow but steady ebb of time and chance. If Raza displeased Orochimaru, odds were very good that the man would simply kill him and destroy his village, or worse. Raza did not trust Orochimaru, but attempting to defy the serpent shinobi would quite likely do more harm than good for his forces. Raza was strong, but Orochimaru was a monster in human form. There were too many factors, too many possibilities to risk trying to put the snake down by his own strength, and there were too few in Suna with the ability to aid him against such an opponent. Baki was the finest of his generation, second only to Raza himself, but he would still be outclassed by someone like Orochimaru. Most of Suna's strongest shinobi were, in a touch of bitter irony, far too old and decrepit to be of any help. Lady Chiyo and her brother, for example, once two of the finest puppet masters in all the land, were nearing dotage in their advanced age. They were still capable enough, perhaps, to tackle merely competent shinobi, but against one of the Sannin they were simply far too weary and enfeebled by the march of time to possibly compare. Honestly, allying with Orochimaru hadn't been much of a choice. Damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. The fourth Kazekage hated those sorts of conundrums. But putting all of that aside, he could not ignore the possibility of a leak somewhere in his village. This letter was worrying. If there was even a tiniest chance that this message might have come from the Hidden Leaf, or any other party outside of Suna and Oto, it would have to be assumed that their plans had been discovered. Raza hadn't led his village through these difficult times by being incautious. He took risks when he felt it was absolutely necessary, but persisting in the plan to invade Konoha when there was a possibility that their security had been compromised would be nothing short of unforgivable foolhardiness. Sighing, and hoping that Orochimaru would not take umbrage at this turn of events, Raza sat down behind his desk and reluctantly fetched his calligraphy set plus a sheet of paper. In a dense and triply redundant code, he began writing a communique to his co-conspirator. Orochimaru, I find myself in the unenviable position of having to inform you of a possible leak of information regarding certain plans which had been made by certain unnamed parties. It was not a good day to be Kazekage. By the time the second stage of the Chunin exams came to an end, 5 more teams had passed. Aside from the Sand team and Squad 7 and 8, there were 3 more teams from the Leaf, and now 1 each from the Sound and Grass. Nobody was surprised by the overwhelming home team advantage. That's how it usually worked out in the Chunin exams, due to a number of factors that only statisticians would find interesting. It was noteworthy that 3 of the Konoha teams had graduated only just that year, and even one of the others had only 1 more year of experience than them. This much, at least, was quite contrary to what most would have expected, even if many of those rookies were clan heirs with great potential. It was a bit disappointing to the Amigakure contingent that none of their own had passed, but no big fuss was raised. Those who dropped out of the first phase or survived the second would have another shot at promotion in 6 months' time. A few of the representatives from Rain would privately commiserate over those they'd known who were lost in the forest of death, of particular note being Team Shiger, whose bodies had been found in a state too gruesome for open casket burial, but as most of the participants had been older, more experienced genin, they were able to accept these casualties as an inevitable facet of their lifestyle, and a very real risk for all of them. It was noticed that 2 of the 8 teams to pass the second phase were from minor villages, 6 out of 24 genin, which was honestly a little below the expected ratio. Of course, Those who were in the know realized that preliminaries would almost certainly need to be held in order to keep the third stage down to a manageable length, so these numbers were liable to change. An unusual, but not unprecedented, circumstance. Hate Gecko quietly wheezed into his fist as he surveyed the assembled genin from a shadowed alcove, listening absent-mindedly as the Lord Third explained the true purpose of the Chunin exams. For most of these kids it would probably be their first time hearing this, and the Hokage did quite a fine job of emphasizing the callousness of shinobi lifestyle. It was a good act on the Sandame's part, convincingly cold and stern enough to have the more sheltered genin wetting themselves, and even the Sun's team seemed a bit put off judging by how their female members spoke up in disbelief. Still, while it was a nice speech, Hate, the other proctors, and the Jounin sensei had all heard it plenty of times before. He doubted that any of them were paying more than a perfunctory level of attention to the Lord Third's words. Even Hate himself was just waiting for his cue to appear and announce the preliminaries. No doubt some of the younger and more impetuous genin would be upset by this news, especially those who had only barely made it to the tower, but Hate didn't particularly care what they thought. He'd gone through a good deal worse at their age, and anyway his thoughts were more focused on the hot bath and cold beer he'd be sharing with his girl when this day was over. I wonder if she'll be wearing that negligee I got her for our anniversary? He dreamily mused, cheering himself up with thoughts of his lover in sheer, form-fitting silk. These preliminaries were sure to be a bore, but at least he had a fun night with Yugao to look forward to, assuming nothing came up that would require her attention, at any rate. Dealing with rowdy drunk foreigners rarely left her in the mood. Even less so when they were stupid enough to try copping a feel, regardless of whatever sorts of play she and her boyfriend might enjoy behind closed doors. Hate's train of thought was rudely cut off, though, when he heard the Hokage's next words. However, before the final phase of the exams can get underway. Ah well, time to break the news to the brats. Turning on the spot, he flickered out of the alcove. Sakura wasn't really listening as the sword-bearing Jounin and the Hokage explained why they would need to hold a preliminary round to pare down the participants for the final stage of the exams. She had already figured as much the second she saw how many teams had passed the second phase, and presently the Pinkette was rather more absorbed in her attempt to put a name to each of the faces she saw. Her fellow rookies were easy enough, of course, as were the members of Team Guy, although it was weird to see Niji alive and well after so many years, even if there were loads of other once dead people walking around, and obviously Gaara and his siblings, too. But the remaining three teams were somewhat harder to place. She recognized Kabuto right away, of course, and it had only taken her a few seconds to register that bespectacled redhead as Naruto's so distant they had never actually bothered to determine their exact relation cousin. The pair's respective teammates were basically unknown to her, though. She vaguely recalled Kabuto's team participating in what she remembered of the preliminaries last time around, but the only thing about them that stood out in her memory was the fact that one of them had fought Sasuke. She dimly recalled being very worried about her now husband's well-being at that time. It was just a little while after he'd gotten that curse mark right, and that his opponent had done something or other that had made her seriously fear for Sasuke, but aside from that she was at a complete loss. She wasn't even entirely sure which one of the two had fought him. Kairin's teammates were a still bigger unknown. They didn't look like anything special. Their manner of dress was more or less the same as the redheads, in a general team coordination sort of way, and they didn't seem to have any obvious specialties. They were probably a couple years the girl's senior, and each stood almost a full head taller than her, but aside from that they didn't look too remarkable. Really, both of them seemed very ordinary, almost generic. They weren't especially good-looking, although they appeared reasonably well-built, and neither one had any particularly distinguishing features. They were people who would probably blend into a crowd with zero difficulty, with the kind of faces you might see on unimportant background characters in a manga or anime. Lastly were the Sound Ninja. Sakura recognized them somewhat, but her memories of the trio were distant, faint. Dosu Kinyuda, Saku Abumi, and Kintsuchi. In another time, they would have tried to kill Sasuke in the Forest of Death, and in protecting him she herself would resolve to stand side by side with her teammates, as an equal and a true shinobi. So she figured they probably weren't too important this time around. With the exposition out of the way, the preliminaries could officially begin. And an algorithm of moderate complexity proceeded to randomly select a pair of numerical values arbitrarily assigned to two separate competitors. Kiba Inuzuka vs. Sasuke Uchiha. Sasuke smiled when he saw his name come up on the computer monitor. Well, looks like I'm up first, he remarked. Huh. Deja vu, Naruto muttered, seeing Kiba's name displayed across from his teammates. Looks like they've randomized the selection. He definitely didn't fight Kiba last time, the blonde added mentally. In fact, I'm pretty sure I fought Kiba. Ah, yes, Kurama said, an undertone of amusement in his voice. I remember that fight, although the sleuths in our old seal had been effectively stopped by Orochimaru's Gogi Fuin. That was rather memorable victory on your part. It took Naruto a moment to remember the details of that match, but when he did he scowled inwardly, catching the meaning behind the fox's snide tone. It wasn't every day that one created an opening for their finishing blow by breaking wind in the opponent's face, after all. Sakura squeezed Sasuke's hand, not privy to the conversation her other teammate was having with the bijou in his gut. She smiled at her husband, leaning in close to whisper. Do go easy on him, dear? Kiba's an okay guy, once you get past all the bragging. Sasuke rolled his eyes at this, but he still nodded. Yeah, he grumbled, looking distinctly miffed. Honestly, though, as if I'd ever actually bother going all out against an opponent of his level. The fact that he happened to say this well within hearing distance of his electronically selected foe may or may not have been a mere coincidence, but the effect was the same either way. Kiba bristled at this apparent dismissal and grit his teeth. A fire was lit in the Inuzuka's belly, and he leaped down into the arena with a stubbornly defiant shout, Akamaru riding in his hood. Kurenai put a hand to her forehead and let out a sigh, exasperated to see just how easily her student was riled. Hinata chortled in quiet amusement, clasping her hands and wishing Kiba luck, to which he replied, I don't need it. I'll kick his ass with pure ability, and Shino simply shook his head, silently settling in to watch the fight. Sasuke strolled leisurely down into the arena, yawning boredly and taking his sweet time. Kiba grew more implacable with every second he waited for his foe, and he shot several venomous looks at the cocky Uchiha. At last, though, Sasuke was in the fighting area. The contestants stood opposite one another, waiting for the fight to begin. Hate, after briefly explaining the rules of engagement for the preliminaries, brought his hand down to signal the start of the match. Kiba and Sasuke stayed in place for a moment, a classic stare down between two warriors, only one of whom actually looked interested in fighting. It's about time someone took you down a peg, Kiba quipped, raising a clenched fist. You might have been hot stuff back in the academy, but this is the real world. Test scores don't mean crap anymore. Sasuke laughed. The academy? He said, rolling his eyes. Please, that might as well have been a lifetime ago. I'd say you're the one who hasn't seen the real world yet. Having said his piece, Sasuke then slipped easily into a defensive combat stance. His eyes were dark, sharing an inactive voice. A declaration of confidence if ever there was one. Don't screw with me, jackass. I'll beat you black and blue, and then we'll see who's the better ninja. Snarling these words, Kiba threw the first punch. Sasuke twitched sideways, dodging the blow with the least amount of movement necessary. He smirked at his opponent, his eyes speaking for him. Is that all you've got? Kiba snapped. What followed was a short but thorough exhibition of every possible punch, kick, and strike the Inuzuka could muster, not a single one of which managed to touch even one hair on his opponent's person. Sasuke didn't retaliate once, but it was obvious that he was controlling the flow of the match. Damn it, you bastard! Kiba shouted in frustration, a furious left jab missing by a mile. Stand still so I can hit you. I am standing still, Sasuke drawled, easily leaning out of the way of a sloppy, by his standards, right hook. I haven't once moved my feet from the starting position, but it seems you couldn't hit the broad side of a barn if you were thrown at it. Kiba growled and sprang back, putting a few paces of distance between himself and Sasuke. He whistled for Akamaru, and reached a hand into his supply pouch. That's it, he said. No more pulling punches. It's time for you to roll over and play dead. He withdrew his hand from the pouch, holding 2 soldier pills. One, he tossed Akamaru. The other, he made to pop into his own mouth. The pills never reached either destination. Almost as soon as the medicine had left his hands, Sasuke caught the pills and crushed them, moving so quickly that most of the people in the room, including a few of the medics and less talented Jounin sensei, didn't even see him until a second after he'd prevented Kiba from using his secret weapon. It took the other lad another second longer than that to realize what had just happened. He jumped and swore, startling and falling back when he realized how close to him Sasuke was suddenly standing. "Christ!" he yelped. "When did you?" "A while ago," Sasuke blithely replied, now standing behind Kiba. "You're just too slow to follow my movements." Again the Inuzuka cursed, but this time instead of trying to put more distance between him and his opponent, he spun around and brought up his elbow, intending to smash it into his foe. Had the blow struck home, it would have caught Sasuke in the throat and probably done some serious damage. But it never landed. Sasuke caught the attack with his one good hand, using Kiba's momentum and a bit of leverage to flip his opponent onto the ground. His fingers subsequently twitched, and before Kiba could even groan in pain, a dozen shuriken were embedded into the floor around him, tracing an unnervingly close outline of his body. "Damn it," Kiba groaned. "Even after all this work, the gap between us has still only widened? I guess there's a reason you were our year's #1 rookie." Sasuke waved a hand dismissively. "Academy rankings are a thing of the past," he said airily. "They have no bearing on our present ability. Really though, you lost this fight the moment you let your temper get away from you. Ninjas must be able to restrain their emotions or else at least learn to function efficiently in spite of them." "Yeah, about that quick question," Kiba grunted. "Does pride count as an emotion?" A smirk crossed Inuzuka's face. In the same instant, Sasuke felt a set of small, needle-like teeth sink into his rear and rip the seat of his pants. He hissed and immediately tore Kiba's partner off of his ass, irritably flinging the pup at its master's face. Neither Ninken nor Ninja remained conscious following that collision. The smirk remained on Kiba's face, though. Sasuke glared at the insensate duo of master and pet, and shot Hei a darkly expectant look. With a cough, the swordsman announced Sasuke the winner. Grumbling and gingerly rubbing his rump, half to cover the tear that final attack had made in his shorts, the one-armed genin stalked back up to the viewing level, where his team awaited. Perhaps it wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but Akamaru's parting shot still stung like a sumbitch. Naruto had the decency not to snigger at Sasuke's discomfort, although amusement was still obvious in the glimmer of his eyes. He clapped his friend on the shoulder and shot him a toothy grin. "Well, you pretty much dominated that fight," he said, probably in an attempt to assuage his pal's wounded dignity. Sasuke gave the blonde a mutinous look. "This is the last time I give my opponent a chance to salvage their pride," he muttered, low enough that only his teammates would hear. "I can't believe I actually stood there and let that mutt bite me." Sakura patted him on the shoulder in a comforting gesture. "Want me to sew up your trousers?" she asked softly, soothingly. "I think Ino might be enjoying the view a little too much." She side-eyed the blonde in question, who was doing a very poor job of hiding the fact that she was unabashed ogling the ripped seat of the Uchiha's shorts. Sasuke shook his head. "No need," he grunted, flicking his hand into an odd seal. "A henge will do for now." And as he said this, a puff of white smoke enveloped his body for an instant. When it dissipated seconds later, Sasuke stood in the same spot, his fingers still flexed into a one-handed approximation of the ram seal. The only change in his appearance was the fact that his shorts now appeared to be completely unmarred. Ino pouted, but Shikamaru and Shuji looked relieved. At least until the latter's name came up on the screen. Shuji Akimichi vs. Naruto Uzumaki. Kakashi wasn't paying too much attention to the proceedings down in the arena. A careworn copy of Ika Ika Violence was clutched in his hands, his one visible eye flicking intently over every character printed onto the novel's pages. He gave Naruto a perfunctory nod when the blonde made to go down to the arena, absent-mindedly noting that two of his students were going one right after the other, before pondering whether or not to give Sasuke a brief lecture on situational awareness. After a moment's thought, he discarded that idea. Listening idly to his remaining students' hushed chatter, he got the impression that Sasuke had consciously let that last attack hit him. Certainly, at least, the boy seemed to mutter, "Better be grateful I didn't completely shatter the mutt's pride," and similar comments with a relative frequency as Sakura patted him on the shoulder and whispered sweet, reassuring nothings into his ear. If this wasn't merely bluster on Sasuke's part, then it had been a rather magnanimous gesture for him to stand there and let Akamaru bite him. These kids were smart. Kakashi had come to greatly appreciate that fact over the months that he'd been teaching them. Sure, half the stuff out of their mouths seemed to consist of incomprehensible inside jokes and impenetrably oblique references he couldn't even begin to place, but they worked together like few teams Kakashi had ever seen. He honestly didn't need to teach them much as far as teamwork exercises or practice drills. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura knew their stuff, and they handily aced every test he put before them. Perhaps Sasuke and Sakura tended to act a little cozier together than kids their age had any right, and maybe Naruto seemed to have a thing going on with the Hyuga clan heiress that might have been very scandalous if he weren't technically a member of a clan every bit as old and powerful, albeit nearly extinct and with little to no remaining influence in Konoha. But Kakashi was not inclined to intervene in their personal lives. Not as long as they handled their duties in a healthy and professional manner. And despite a number of quirks and eccentricities, he had to say that they did exactly that. Team 7 was probably the single most capable and synchronized genin squad since that period in between the Second and Third Shinobi World Wars when the legendary Sannin had gotten themselves demoted for a week as punishment for interrupting their sensei's alone time with his wife, a tale Kakashi knew from his sensei, who had apparently extracted it from his sensei one night after an exceptionally long day of boozing and whoring on the Toad Sage's part. Kakashi had to admit that he'd grown rather fond of his little monsters. Sure, there was practically no logical way to reconcile their present ability with their performance in the academy, and yeah, they occasionally acted a bit dismissive of his rank, but damn it all, there was just something likable about the trio. Against all odds, they had actually grown on him. And in light of the mind-boggling strength and ability he had seen them demonstrate on so many occasions, the copy ninja found himself daring to hope that these three would actually survive him. That was a nice thought. Of course, so was the prospect of a threesome with a buxom younger stepsister and an nymphomaniacal, bespectacled childhood friend. So in spite of his internal monologue, most of Kakashi's mind was honestly focused on the contents of the book in his hand. Oh, Boruto-kun Ranchi and Hinajika moaned. Won't you please accept our feelings? We want you so much. Kakashi giggled pervertedly, turning the page and letting himself become immersed in the graphically descriptive language and compellingly suggestive dialogue of the Toad Sage's infamously shameless smut. It really wasn't a surprise when Naruto emerged victorious from his fight with Chuji. Hinata, Sasuke, and Sakura would not have expected anything less from the 7th Hokage. He was kinder than Sasuke, though, and much more generous, and thus the match had lasted a decent length of time. Naruto was used to sparring with opponents far beneath him in skill and power, and while it was a little difficult to try and reconcile this portly, quivering child with the unfailingly resolute mountain of muscle and sinew he knew as the Akimichi clan head, he still felt a fondness for the boy who had in another time become one of the strongest shinobi alive, boasting raw physical strength to rival even Sakura, and stamina only a little short of matching that immovable, indefatigable titan of a man had been one of his staunchest supporters for as long as he could remember. More than that, though, Chuji had been one of the few kids to act with kindness towards him in his days at the academy. His younger self might have been cocky and dismissive of the chubby clan heir, failing to notice or appreciate those small, rare friendly gestures, but Naruto as he was now understood and was grateful for what little camaraderie as slackers and troublemakers had existed between him, Chuji, Shikamaru, and Kiba in those halcyon days of early youth. Of course, Naruto had a bad habit of looking at the world through rose-tinted lenses, so perhaps he was letting nostalgia goggles warp his perspective. Whatever the case, he made an effort to keep the fight roughly on Chuji's level. He had plenty practice in pulling his punches from all the times he'd had to smack his son upside the head after an idiotic stunt, such as trying to perform the shadow clone jutsu when he was just an academy student, or attempting to sneak itching powder into a foreign diplomat's robes, and was similarly experienced at sparring with far weaker opponents from training both his kids in the basics. So he'd let Chuji get a few hits in, demonstrated some simple but effective maneuvers that could greatly improve the lad's combat effectiveness, and even given him an opening big enough to use his clan's Nikuden Sasha. Only after the fight had gone on for a few minutes did he finally deign to end it, making sure to finish things with no higher a level of power than would seem entirely attainable to the ordinary genin. Sure, he could have finished the match as soon as it had begun and completely dismantled every facet of Chuji's fighting style, but that would have only dispirited and discouraged the kid. Being completely outmatched by someone who was ostensibly near your age never felt good, and not everyone was bullheaded enough to stubbornly power through such a gap of skill. Sometimes you had to throw people a bone and let them believe they were only a little short of matching you, otherwise they might give up completely. Naruto was actually a very good teacher, regardless of whatever Sasuke might say about his intellect. Gaara vs. Dose Kinuta. This was the next matchup selected by the computer. Kankuro and Temari eyed their youngest brother warily as he stared at the monitor, a stoic face betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. A small crinkling of the brow was the only sign that Gaara registered what he was seeing, for a moment, until a quiet hum resonated from the back of his throat. He cocked his head ever so slightly, before looking across the room to where Team 7 was standing. Naruto caught Gaara's eye and grinned. Gaara frowned, then he turned on the spot and let his sand swirl about to cover his trail. Suna Shunshin was his specialty of his. This manner of locomotion gave the illusion of his body dissipating into sand, and rematerializing from the very same substance, an aesthetic that had powerful effects on his fellow hidden sand citizens. He reappeared down in the arena, waiting a few more seconds for his opponent to get there. "You must be Gaara of the Sand," the Sound Genin remarked once he was in position. "I've heard of your reputation." Shikaku twitched in the back of his mind, and Gaara felt a brief rush of kill blood crush kill, murderous intent. He closed his eyes for a second, taking a small breath to calm himself. "You have you?" The cork popped out of his gourd, dissipating into a small mass of sand. Dosa might have smiled beneath those bandages. It was hard to tell for certain, but he sure sounded pretty smug. "Oh, I have," he said, raising his right hand. He tapped the big, strange, regularly perforated armor-looking hunk of metal worn over his forearm. "And I must say that I am curious." Gaara narrowed his eyes, barely even noticing as Hade declared the start of the match. "About what?" This time, Dosa definitely smiled. "Which is faster, do you suppose?" He mused aloud, cocking his head and tapping that weird, massively oversized bracer again. "Your sand or my sound?" In that moment, Gaara became aware of a loud, almost painful ringing in his ears. His eyes widened, and he listened backwards, suddenly staggering as a wave of vertigo struck him head-on. His vision swam, and he had to fight to right himself. What the hell?" he groaned, clenching his teeth as the pain increased. Dosa sprang forward, bringing his fist up in a sweeping right hook. Sand rushed from Gaara's gourd, automatically interposing itself between the otonin and the. It reached out to wrap around Dosa's arm, and the sand made a cacophonous racket as it poured through and over the holes in the teen's bracer. The noise was unbearable. Gaara clapped his hands to his ears and screamed. Blood trickled out from under his palms, and the pain was threatening to split his head in half. Dosa laughed and flicked an exposed part of his bracer, his jutsu causing the sand to explode away from his arm. "Bad luck you were matched against me, really," the Sound Ninja sneered, "but your so-called absolute defense is no use against my attacks." Gaara grit his teeth, giving Dosa a wild look. "Surrender now," he growled, wincing from the pain and swaying on his feet. "I decided that I'd try not to kill my opponents if I didn't have to, but if you come any closer, I can't promise you'll leave this place alive." "You can't even block my attacks without setting off my melody arm," Dosa scoffed. "And you don't look like you can continue to stand under your power much longer either. What could you possibly do to me in that state?" Gaara shakily reached out with one hand, exhaling a single word in a sharp hiss. His eyes sparked with a sudden determination, and sand rushed up to meet the approaching shinobi. Win. From head to toe, every inch of Dosa Kinuta except for his melody arm, and his face, was promptly buried under a faintly preposterous quantity of sand. And just like that, the Sound Ninja belatedly realized that maybe it hadn't been such a great idea to actively provoke the human WMD. "Oh God, I surrender," he yelped, immediately abandoning any pretense of dignity. "Please don't kill me." Gaara looked up to the higher level for a moment. Then he let his hand drop, releasing the sand's grip on his opponent. "Count yourself lucky," he said icily. "But I'd prefer not to be disqualified for killing an opponent after they've already surrendered." Dosa whimpered. Naruto, from where he was watching the match with his teammates, nodded his head approvingly. Among the matches that followed, only a few more were of any particular note. Temari fought Sakuabumi in a duel of wind users, and while it was an impressive show of skill on both their parts, it also dragged on inordinately long, winding up in something of a stalemate until Zaku finally dropped from exhaustion. His ultimately required a greater initial investment of chakra than her Kamaitachi. Kabuto's contortionist teammate was matched up with Shikamaru, and his boast of finishing the match in under a minute certainly came true, albeit perhaps not in the way he'd intended. The Nara clan's specialty shadow possession jutsu interacted with his joint dislocating trick in a rather painful and gruesome fashion. Karen's teammates were next slated to fight each other, an arrangement which surprised some people, and while both showed an average amount of cunning and resourcefulness, it ultimately came down to a brute force slugfest. The match didn't go on for very long, but the victor didn't exactly walk away unscathed. Both sported a myriad of cuts and bruises when they left the arena. Tenten received a number of furtive warnings and well-wishings from Niji when the computer matched her up against Hinata. The weapon mistress, of course, treated her teammates' words with a healthy dose of skepticism, having no way to know that she was going up against a gentle fist master 2 decades her senior. Needless to say, Hinata completely shut down Tenten's shuriken jutsu, and even her melee was little match for the Hyuga's hand-to-hand expertise. Hinata effortlessly disarmed her opponent every time she drew a weapon, and she pressed her advantage by keeping in close and denying Tenten any opening in which to summon more tools from her scrolls. Although she specialized in weapons, particularly ranged, throwing ones, Tenten was no slouch in the taijutsu department. She could hardly afford to be deficient there, as a student of Might Guy. Despite this, however, she obviously stood no chance in a close-quarters fight against someone like Hinata. 8 trigrams, 16 palms was the finisher, a mere quarter of the Hyuga main branch's most well-known, and Hinata pulled it off with appropriate ease. Niji gave Tenten his sincerest condolences when she came back up from her match. Tenten replied with a look that could have petrified Medusa. "I don't want to hear anything about your damn or," she hissed, misconstruing, in her frustrated disappointment at losing, Niji's fear of Hinata and resultant worry for her as a chauvinistic belief in the automatic superiority of Hyuga Shinobi over everyone else. This misunderstanding bothered Niji more than he would have expected. That little bit of team guy drama aside, the next fight was Shino versus Kabuto's other teammate, the guy who drained chakra by touching people. To most ninja that jutsu probably would have seemed pretty intimidating, but Shino merely quirked an eyebrow at the first demonstration of this technique before commenting. "So you can only affect someone within arm's reach of yourself? How disappointing." Then he dissolved into a swarm of Kikaichu, which rose up and engulfed his enemy before he had time to react. "You will find that my jutsu has no such limitation." Naturally, this move promptly resulted in Shino being declared the victor. Ino and Kin fought after that. At first, the sound Kunoichi seemed rather cocksure of her chances, but that confidence quickly deflated when Ino systematically dismantled every aspect of her ninjutsu, sticking makeshift plugs in her ears to avoid getting tricked by the bells, and engaging the raven-haired lass up close. She dominated the fight, ending it after 20 seconds by kicking a battered Kin to the floor and pressing a kunai to her throat. There was a reason Ino had the one of highest cumulative scores out of their year group back in the academy. She'd been runner-up for Rookie of the Year, and against someone like Sasuke that was no mean feat. After that, Sakura fought Kankuro, and it went about as well for the puppet user as one might expect. Sakura had gone toe-to-toe with Akasuna no Sasori as a chunin, albeit with the aid of puppet mistress Chio, and she had improved by leaps and bounds since then. Kankuro's tricks were all too predictable at this level. She completely dismantled Karasu, and not even the nastiest stuff it could spew was any match for her medical ninjutsu. Not that anything it threw actually hit her. If there was one thing Tsunade's training was good for, it was teaching people how to dodge. Now, coming down to the last 2 fights of preliminaries, there were only how many possible matchups? Let's see: Rock Lee vs. Kabuto Yakushi, Karen vs. Niji Hyuga, Kabuto Yakushi vs. Niji Hyuga, Rock Lee vs. Karen, Karen vs. Kabuto Yakushi, or Rock Lee vs. Niji Hyuga. So that's 6. 6 possible matches, not counting what order the names might be in. Funnily enough, while the selection algorithm was ostensibly random, it had to be said that the choice which wound up appearing on the monitor was, of course, nothing other than Rock Lee vs. Niji Hyuga. Some things just work out like that. "Sensei!" Lee exclaimed, spinning to look his instructor in the eye. "The match I've awaited is here." Guy laughed, grinning at the enthusiasm on his protégé's face. Indeed it is, Lee. Niji, he declared, looking over his two male students. You kids have made me proud to come this far in the Chunin exams, but it looks like only one of you will make it to the third phase. He struck a flamboyant pose, giving both Niji and Lee a thumbs up. Go, young men, and fight. With your pride on the line, commit everything you have to this match. Niji, much like Tenten, put little to no store by these theatrics. Lee, on the other hand, treated every word out of his sensei's mouth like the gospel truth. The former scoffed and stalked down into the arena, not wanting to waste his time on any more of Guy's rambling, but Lee hung back for a moment, fire burning in his eyes. Karen watched from nearby, anxiously vacillating over whether or not to wish her crush good luck. Do you mean it, sensei? Lee breathed, looking up at Guy as though he almost didn't dare to hope. To give this fight everything I have? Guy struck the nice guy pose, giving his student a thumbs up and a toothy grin, pristine enamel audibly glinting. Show them the power of hard work. Lee's face nearly split in half from the smile which flashed across it. Nodding so fast his head was just a blur, he immediately knelt down and fiddled with his leg warmers. He whipped the weights off of his legs so fast that they hadn't even hit the ground when he then backflipped into the arena. Twin clouds of dust and rubble blossomed between Guy and Tenten at the same moment Lee touched down in the arena, his weights hitting the ground right as he landed. Niji probably would have paid this some actual heed if he hadn't been wrapped up in brooding about all of the various reasons his life sucked. Almost everyone else present was slack-jawed in disbelief. Hay blinked, staring at the twin mushroom clouds up on the spectators' level. With a cough and a wary look towards Lee, the proctor raised a hand. To a good fight, Lee said with an eager grin, giving his rival a thumbs up. Niji said nothing. Hate swung his arm down. Begin! In the blink of an eye, Niji crossed the distance between himself and his foe. He thrust his left arm forward, fingers extended, aiming for Lee's shoulder. With a good hit to the there, he'd be able to greatly inhibit his teammate's combat ability, and from there the match would be. The Hyuga prodigy felt this train of thought catastrophically derail as his hand was pushed harmlessly aside, Lee pressing two fingers to his rival's wrist as he deflected the attempted attack. Niji blinked, astonished by this abrupt turn of events. Wait, what? When did Lee get this fast? To his credit, Niji did not let this surprise knock him off kilter for more than an instant. His other hand shot up, aiming for the opening in his opponent's defenses, and Lee blocked that strike with his other hand, catching Niji's two outstretched fingers between his own middle and pointer. All of this happened in under a second. Niji's first hand was still pressed to one side, and his second was caught in Lee's grip. For an instant, it seemed like a deadlock. Then Lee's foot snapped up, crashing into Niji's face. Naruto curiously examined one of the leg weights Lee had left up on the balcony, blithely ignoring the dirty looks Tenten was shooting him. Apparently the brunette had recently deduced his distant relation to Karen. He'd overheard the redhead mentioning that she was of Uzumaki descent in between gushing over Lee and smirking at Tenten, and decided to blame him for the intrusions the overly amorous bespectacled censor had made into Team Guy's dynamic. Huh, he said, tracing a finger over the repeating characters which proclaimed guts. This is sure some fancy seal work. No wonder Lee doesn't leave massive craters everywhere he goes. Tenten snorted. Clearly you've never seen him practicing that lotus move, she muttered. Guy smiled toothily, though, giving Naruto a nice guy pose in the affirmative. Indeed, those weights are a work of nothing less than sheer brilliance, he boasted. The late 4th Hokage was kind enough to fashion them for me, back when he was just your sensei's jounin instructor. He observed the rivalry between myself and Kakashi, and clearly believed that the competition between us could only benefit his prized pupil. Guy's teeth blinked, and he let out a boisterous laugh. Yes, these weights don't simply weigh Lee down. The sealing jutsu inside them transforms their mass into a pressure that places resistance on muscles throughout the body, and not just the ones responsible for lifting one's legs. So Lee isn't just running faster, Naruto observed. Basically every muscle in his body has been fighting ridiculous amounts of resistance while he wore those weights, and now that he's taken them off he's doing just about everything faster. He already knew all of this, of course, but someone had to provide exposition for all the unenlightened onlookers. One thing was quickly becoming obvious to Niji, as Lee hammered at him with a punishing flurry of strikes. I've been slacking off on my physical conditioning. That was what he thought as Lee kicked him back several feet, only to appear right behind him with a cocked fist before he could even land, seemingly moving instantly. Niji's next few thoughts, naturally, were mostly just variations on the theme of "ow, that hurt." Lee juggled his teammate back and forth across the arena a couple more times, before coming to a near standstill long enough to let Niji regain his footing. "Do you see now?" he said, staring down his woozy and staggering foe. "This is the difference between you and I, Niji. While you were born with extraordinary talent, and I was born with no talent at all, one of us has pushed himself to the limit every day, resolutely striving to surpass his weakness, while the other has allowed himself to grow complacent, confident in his own superiority." He vanished for a moment, and Nijis only caught the slightest ghost of movement before Lee reappeared inches from his face, fist poised and ready to strike. "Through the power of hard work, I have crossed the gulf between us and reversed the scale of our powers." The punch made contact, and Niji's world once more exploded into pain and pretty colors. "Kya!" Karen squealed, watching delightedly as her crush walked all over his opponent. "Lee-kun so cool." Tenten twitched and scowled at the redhead, who was annoyingly standing closer to Team Guy than to her own squad, not that the girl's teammates seemed particularly perturbed by this fact, mind you. Naruto was standing back by Team 7, now, watching the match and idly cheering Lee on. Hinata, standing between her own teammates, but not too far from the blonde, called down occasional words of encouragement to her cousin. The latter's support seemed to be having a somewhat adverse effect, however, considering the way Niji seemed to twitch and tense up for just a fraction of a second every time he heard Hinata's voice. Despite still being a bit miffed about her Hyuga teammate's apparent dismissal of her chances a couple rounds ago, Tenten only somewhat reluctantly shouted out a few cheers for Niji as well. Lee didn't seem bothered by her seemingly siding with his rival, probably partially because of just how badly Niji was losing right now. He was a surprisingly good sport like that. And make no mistake, Niji Hyuga was losing this fight. He may have been more skilled than Lee, having had several years to master the flows and stances of his clan's gentle fist, whereas his teammate hadn't even begun to learn Gai's Toucan until less than a year ago, but that didn't mean much in this instance. Niji was a far better martial artist than Lee, much closer to mastery than the boy who had proclaimed himself the genius's rival, but skill could only do so much against such overwhelming speed and strength. It was actually rather ingenious, Niji noted in a corner of his mind. He'd been learning the from a young age, and thus had a considerable head start over Lee, so for the bowl-cut lad to properly close the gap in their respective martial ability could have taken years, perhaps in excess of a decade. Therefore, it seemed Guy had chosen to focus heavily on building up Lee's physical strength, speed, and stamina. Lee didn't have any ninjutsu or genjutsu to fall back on, so he had to focus thrice as hard on improving his body. And with his work ethic, that apparently meant a simply ludicrous increase in speed. Niji felt a blindingly fast hammer blow strike his side, and he staggered, narrowing his eyes and trying to work out where Lee would be next. He caught a flicker of movement behind him, an instant of deceleration in which his opponent slowed, however briefly, to a speed he could actually see. Niji's arms snapped up in a defensive position, his legs swinging and torso twisting in an attempt to sidestep the coming attack. Lee missed him by fractions of an inch, and Niji's hands zipped out to strike his foe's side. He hit nothing but air. Damn! Niji mentally cursed, spinning around the moment he realized Lee had sped back up. I still can't completely follow his movements. Leave Hurricane! A lightning-fast kick swept Niji's legs out from under him, coming from the opposite side of where the Hyuga had just been guarding, and Lee raised his foot as he spun around for the second blow, this time catching his rival's left arm with a nasty crack. With as inundated as his body was with adrenaline, and it took Niji a couple seconds to properly register the fact that his arm was now broken. It wasn't anything massive or especially ugly, probably just a simple hairline fracture, but it still hurt like a motherfucker, bad enough to overwhelm his senses for a moment. He blacked out from the pain. When Niji came to an instant later, stubbornly fighting to regain his senses, it was to see the scuffed and cracked tile floor rushing up to meet him. He closed his eyes and reflexively swung out his arms to catch himself, in his beaten and weary state acting purely on instinct. This was what finally decided the match. As it turns out, subjecting a newly cracked bone to that kind of abrupt shock had very painful consequences. Niji probably would have screamed himself hoarse if he hadn't immediately passed out from the pain. He was good, but far from invincible. Lee, of course, was ecstatic over his victory. He at least had the decency to wait until a couple minutes after the medics had carted Niji off before jumping for joy at finally overcoming his rival, but there was no mistaking how excited he was. Sasuke watched in bemusement as Karen hugged a cheering Lee while Tenten visibly waffled over whether to congratulate one teammate or check up on the other. It was quite the spectacle, and reminded him of just how dedicated to that rivalry the taijutsu specialist had really been in his youth. Guy did not hesitate to intervene with a wicked punch, however, proceeding to scold Lee about getting overconfident, declaring that this was only the first step in a long and arduous journey, and that his real training still had yet to begin. From here on out, Lee, your every waking moment will be spent suffering through a living hell like no other. I will break you down until nothing remains, and then build you back up into a model shinobi. The flames of youth will fuel the crucible of hardship, and nothing less than absolute, unswerving guts and determination will see you through this ordeal. Then he punched Lee a second time before pulling the kid close and hugging him, promptly tearing up and babbling about hard work, friendship, and victory. Sasuke probably would have winced in sympathy for the lad if Lee's adult self hadn't forced him to partake in some of his utterly obscene training regimens shortly after the Uchiha's proper return to Konoha. So as far as he was concerned, the sadist would simply be getting his just desserts. He didn't care if this statement made no causal, temporal, or logical sense. That was just the way he rolled. But then the computer buzzed, and everyone looked up to the monitor to see what the last match would be. There was only one option, of course, since all other possible participants had gone, but it was still a bit surreal to see the matchup displayed on the screen, especially for the four who had been here for these events last time around. Sasuke didn't remember whether he'd been conscious for the whole preliminaries, as his memory of them was very foggy and almost non-existent, but he was still pretty sure that this was not a fight that would have happened back then. Grim determination was the name of the look on Karen's face. She stared at the LCD where the final matchup was being displayed, narrowing her eyes and feeling something bloodthirsty and savage come clearly blinking into wakefulness. Karen vs. Kabuto Yakushi. She read the names on the monitor. Finally, her turn had come. It was time to show Lee-kun what she was made of. The pang of unease at fighting on her own, without backup from her teammates, was drowned out by thoughts of impressing the boy who had saved her life, reunited her with her team, and helped them pass the second test without asking for anything in return. Had she not been smitten with him from the word go, Karen might have had something smarmy or cynical to say about this naively chivalrous attitude. But she was smitten with him, and quite hopelessly so. Rock Lee didn't look very cool, and despite a very fit body he wasn't what most girls would call handsome, yet none of these things seemed very important to Karen. Perhaps it was a byproduct of her weakness for knights in shining armor, her childhood fantasies of a classical rescue romance unfolding between herself and some charming Prince Charming. Lee saved her life. This was no exaggeration. Had it not been for his timely intervention, scavengers would probably be picking the remains of her carcass clean right about now. Whatever the reason, that bear had been singularly intent on mauling her, and even with the inexorable hardiness and vitality of an Uzumaki descendant, she probably would not have survived its ravages. Some kunoichi would take offense at being rescued, girls who bitterly disdained the stereotype of weak and helpless females overcompensating for society's biased expectations by snapping and biting the head off of any male who showed even the slightest signs of doing anything that might possibly make things easier on them. Rightly or wrongly, there were people out there who would sooner die than accept help from another person, but Karen wasn't one of them. In all honesty, she rather liked the idea of a strong, brave man swearing to protect her and risking his life for her sake. Perhaps this mindset conformed to certain stereotypes, but Karen didn't really care. She knew what she liked, and she was not remotely ashamed of her white knight complex. Rock Lee stopped that bear with a single kick, saving her from a painful, most likely incredibly gruesome death. This alone would have tugged at Karen's heartstrings and made her swoon, but he hadn't stopped there. Over their next 3 days in the forest, Lee had stuck out his neck to escort Karen back to her teammates and help her get through the second phase of the exams alive. He'd been a perfect gentleman, and entirely receptive to Karen's flirtations. That last part was really a big factor. Certainly, even if Karen had been saved by someone who didn't go out of their way to do anything further and didn't appear the least bit welcoming of her tentative advances, she probably still would have carried a torch for them for several months afterwards, at the very least. But with Lee, well, he made it all too easy for her to get flustered and love-struck around him. He was so polite, earnest, and friendly. Another person might have found the more zealous and hot-blooded aspects of his personality overbearing or off-putting, but Karen felt oddly inspired by it. He told her all about himself, in the time they'd spent together. He told her about how he was teased and looked down on by the other kids when he was younger, how he'd started out with absolutely no talent as a ninja, how he had only barely graduated the academy on the strength of his written exam. And he told her also about how he had come so close to giving up, how his continued failure to amount to anything had left him frustrated and hopeless, and how Guy-sensei had pushed him through that funk and inspired him to do his best, inspired him to work harder than anyone else, and push himself further than anyone else, to surpass his own limitations through sheer guts and determination. Hearing all of these things had led Karen to appreciate and admire Lee in a deeper, more nuanced way than before. Where she had initially seen him just as the fit, strong, brave young man who'd saved her from an otherwise certain death, she now saw someone like and yet unlike herself, a person with insecurities and flaws and hopes and dreams. At her age, it was easy to idealize a crush, to raise them in her mind to an impossible level, to assume the absolute best about them in every way, only to inevitably be let down when the truth struck home, when they learned beyond any concealment of lies or denial that nobody was perfect. It was easy to love the person you thought someone to be, but sometimes much harder to love the person they actually were. Karen could have idolized Lee and mentally elevated him to a practically godlike status, but that would not have been the basis for a healthy crush or relationship. Learning of Lee's flaws, of everything he disliked and resented about himself, of all his doubts and failings, and all the effort it took him to try and move beyond these things, only deepened Karen's admiration for him. It would, perhaps, be rash to call what she felt love. Karen was only a child, yet, barely even a teenager. She had not acquired the maturity or depth of emotional nuance to feel the full extent of something so vast and profound as true love, but she could feel a shadow of it, a puerile and youthful approximation of something not entirely dissimilar. It was only a crush, maybe, but to her it was as serious as life or death, and as real as the nose on her face. She wanted Lee to see her, to watch her rise above her own weaknesses and become a true shinobi, much as he had done himself. She wanted to show him her strength, to have him acknowledge her, to impress him and have him take her into his arms and whisper his praises of her bravery and skill and… Karen blushed, shaking her head as she walked into the arena. Focus, girl. Don't let your mind wander. If you want Lee to look at you like that, you know what you have to do. Karen's expression hardened, becoming a mask of grim determination. She would win. She would show Lee exactly what she was made of. She would astound him and make him fall head over heels for her, as much as she herself had for him. This was what she thought. Perhaps it was not an entirely realistic expectation, but Karen was young. As far as she knew, that was how romance worked. A thrill raced up her spine as she faced her opponent. He was older than her, and his chakra felt larger than a good number of the other genin, but there were several present who dwarfed his power, the most noticeable of whom was the boy who had introduced himself a couple days ago as Naruto Uzumaki, the one who had sent Karen that invitation for a family reunion. Compared to that guy, this bespectacled fellow's chakra seemed downright puny. There was something a little off about his energy signature, of course, but Karen was too wrapped up in her determination to win and impress Lee to really care about this. She was single-mindedly focused on the fight before her, working herself up into a nightly furor as she steeled her resolve and prepared to fight. You can do this, Karen. You just have to kick this loser's ass. Then Lee will see how cool you are, and he'll be totally impressed and want to ask you out on a date, and then maybe one thing will lead to another, and… Karen grinned savagely and licked her lips. Despite her youth and waif-like physique, something about this expression was undeniably fearsome. Probably it was an Uzumaki female thing. Hate announced the start of the match, and Karen was an instant from pouncing when Kabuto threw up his hands. I forfeit, he said. Karen blinked. Kabuto smiled innocently at the redhead who had been inches away from beating him up in hopes of impressing her crush. Hate coughed. Ah, I see, said the proctor. Well, in that case, I guess Karen is the winner. There was silence as the onlookers processed this utterly anticlimactic outcome. Another second passed before Karen snapped and threw herself at Kabuto, prompting Hate and several other jounin to intervene. "I'll kill you!" the rampaging Uzumaki roared at her would-have-been opponent. Lee, blissfully oblivious to the circumstances, enthusiastically cheered her on. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out,